So Graham, we talk about numbers quite often as being a really important part of the structure of the idea. What do you mean by that when you talk about numbers?
Yeah, well, when we talk about numbers in this context, we mean some of the dimensions or impacts you expect the idea to have, or perhaps the scope over which the idea might work. The dimensions are actually an important part of the design of the idea, and they'll be very important ultimately when it comes to figuring out the delivery of the idea, how it will actually work in practice. It's difficult to explain the viability of an idea unless you've got some kind of numbers that give it a sense of scale. It's quite a different thing, for example, to try to evaluate an idea you expect to deliver, say, £100,000 worth of sales, and an idea you expect to deliver £5 million worth of sales over the same period. You might be talking about broadly the same terms, you might have broadly the same technology and the same way you expect the idea to work, but the requirements are going to be quite different. So it's really very important to make sure that numbers are built into the core, the fabric, the specification really from the outset. So in other words, you're kind of asking yourself, what does this idea need to deliver?
Yep, and the thing is, we see it all the time that when we do expect people to add numbers to their idea, they can be quite reluctant to do so. Have you any ideas why you think that is the case?
Well, definitely some people feel that when they make estimates that somehow then that becomes like a commitment on their part, and that later on they believe they'll be held sort of accountable for those commitments, even though they're not really commitments at all. Estimates are in a sense a kind of prototype really that we can use to learn from. They can help figure out the idea. People can be reluctant to commit numbers from estimates to paper though, because they don't want to commit themselves when there is so much uncertainty surrounding the idea, as there would be at the outset especially. Having said that, someone once said that all estimates are wrong, but some are useful. And I think that this is good advice for the early stages of innovation. You need to get over being too worried about precision and accuracy of the estimate versus the intention and the usefulness that it brings to the sort of proper consideration of the idea. It actually makes it easier to visualize the idea and almost see how it might work in practice. And that doesn't require to the nth degree precision. Again, though, people get all concerned that when they make an estimate, they feel it needs to be super accurate, and that's not really the point at this stage.
Yeah, I know one of the things you talk about quite often is Fermi estimating as a means of helping people to make useful estimates. Could you explain in a bit more detail what Fermi estimating is and how it can be used?
Mm-hmm. So Fermi estimating is a means really by which anyone can make useful estimates, especially related to the development of new ideas. Enrico Fermi was an Italian-American academic and prominent physics professor who became famous for using very practical methods to provide useful estimates for what most other people thought were impossible to quantify situations. The core concept is that we all probably know more about a given subject or situation than we realise. Fermi would famously test his students with questions like, how many piano tuners live within the city limits of Chicago, which is the city where he taught. And when you're confronted by that kind of question, your immediate reaction is likely to be, how on earth are you supposed to know that? But what Fermi demonstrated was that you can break that question down into smaller contributing elements, each of which you will probably be able to make a reasonable stab at estimating from either your acquired knowledge or your experience. So by building these elements together, a useful estimate for the required quantity is actually achievable. So for new ideas, it'll be the usual things like how much we're going to sell, or how much will it cost, or how will this perform. All of these feel like impossible questions at the outset, but Fermi estimates make it doable even when we know very little, or we think we know very little. Sometimes we use confidence intervals to help when we try to set absolute limits of the quantity in question. So that would be something like, well, it couldn't be possibly more than a certain value, and it couldn't be possibly less than a certain value. and that kind of contains the quantity. And we use Fermi estimates a lot. We find it helps people overcome their fears and their reluctance to get into numbers in the first place.
Yeah, but just to be clear, we wouldn't be expecting that every idea that's submitted right from the outset of an innovation challenge has got Fermi estimating associated with it, are we?
No, probably not. Sometimes it's difficult to know if an idea is going to look interesting until you put numbers into it. But for the most part, you would usually pick an idea to work on that just has got a bit of energy and excitement about it. And that can usually emerge without the numbers, but we normally expect you to do some estimating from the point at which an idea is selected for further work. In fact, it's one of the first things we would suggest you do once you've picked an idea to work on.